Okay, so before I begin, I'd like to take some time and thank some people and things in my life that without any doubt were instrumental in me getting to this point. So first and foremost, I'd like to start off by thanking the National Speech and Debate Association for not only hosting this tournament, but providing youth around the world with the amazing opportunity of being able to participate in this activity of speech and debate. I'd also like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for sponsoring this new form of debate that allows for debaters to explore philosophical questions about our universe, as well as their generous contributions to forensic programs across the country. I'd also like to thank them for providing young conservative youth with a voice. And thanks to the Manatee District for being gracious hosts of this tournament, and students of Broward County for such gracious hosts in overcoming adversity this year. There are also a great deal of people in my personal life that I would like to quickly go over and thank. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my parents for not only financing my way here, but also paying for my food this time. Without you, not only would I been able to be born into this world, but I would not have been able to sustain myself for this long. But really, as first-generation immigrants, you have sacrificed so much just so that I can have more opportunities and live a better life. And next, I'd like to thank my coach, Mr. Roby Holland. Now, obviously, no successful debate program can exist without a coach, but Holland, you for me truly have gone far beyond someone just running a program. No matter what I did, you accepted me and showed me that you believed in me all the way through. This week you stayed up with me through the early morning, not only to support me morally, but also constantly giving me like prep help, which to the extent only private consultants that I paid for would do. And I'm aware this kind of thing is something I can't take for granted, and I'm really happy to have you as a coach. We actually also have a second coach named Michael Jennings, who's actually not here with us today because he decided that his wedding was more important than this, so that's all he gets. Next, I'd like to thank the entire Anderson Speech and Debate team for being such a tight-knit community to come here and support me. Every single one of you guys contributed to making my way here, but in that community, there's some particular people, and I don't want to talk this long, so I'm not going to go into that much detail, but just really quickly, I'd like to thank my former coach, Nathan DuPont. He was not only the person to get me excited about speech and debate, but he also had to deal with me as a freshman, so that's pretty cool. I'd like to thank also former and current members on our speech and debate team, especially the PF team, which is where I grew as a debater. Anindu, Christian, Bryce, William, David, thanks for teaching me how to debate. Now graduated my former PF partner, Zach, who also had to deal with me as a freshman. Thanks for not abandoning me and sticking with me. You really helped a lot. John, David, Robin, thanks for being people who truly found a profound interest in big questions debate as much as I did and supporting me through this and just my daily life. Callum, David, and Sarah, I love you. You guys know how important you are to me. And finally, Mr. David Arard, know that you're one of the most caring people I've ever met, and not only have you done so much for me beyond debate, but you've also been a role model of the kind of person I want to be when I grow older. And also thanks to my Lake Travis buddies that we were traveling with, especially Evan. You helped me prep late nights even when this was not your event, so I really appreciate that. This has been a truly amazing run, and I appreciate every single person in my life, genuinely. Anyway, sorry that was a little bit long. Having said that, is everybody ready? Opponent?
Yeah.
Sweet. I affirm the resolution resolved. Humans are fundamentally different from other animals. To clarify the round, I offer the following observations. Observation 1. According to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, fundamental is defined as a determining essential structure or function. This means that this debate should be on two things. First, just like how the essence of water is H2O, this debate should be centered on what exactly the essential property of a human is and whether any other animals identify with that property. Second, in this debate, we must also discuss what maintains the harmony and bonds within human society and whether that central idea is different compared to that of other animals. We should prefer this interpretation of fundamental over others, as not only is it the most widely accepted interpretation/definition, but it also allows us an opportunity to look at the difference of humans and animals on a much more holistic level, giving us more ground to debate. My sole contention is the possession of an intellectual ability that far exceeds that of biological necessity. Humans have shown this in two ways. Subpoint A is a creation and transfer of complex abstract language. According to NYU professor Thomas Nagel in his book, What Does It All Mean? When we use words such as tobacco, we're able to reach and refer to all the tobacco that exists in the universe. This is thanks to our linguistic and cognitive capacity to ignore the many minute differences among the different tobaccos that exist throughout our universe and identify the essential property of what it means to be tobacco. This mental capacity of having abstract language has led to two properties in humans that are fundamentally different from other animals. The first is conceptual thought. Professor of bioethics at Franciscan University, Patrick Lee, writes, human beings are fundamentally different in kind from other animals in having a rational nature. Human beings perform acts of conceptual thought, and such acts are fundamentally different kinds of acts in sensing, perceiving, or imaging. An act of understanding is the grasping of a nature shared by many things. To understand is not just to know water by sensing it, but to know what it is to be water. By understanding, we apprehend a nature held in common by many entities. By contrast, the object of these sensory powers is always at a particular place in time. The contrast is evident among the examination of language. Winston Churchill is a name that refers to a determinate individual, whereas nouns like human and organism are common names. If we say organisms are composed of cells, the word organism designates a class that extends indefinitely into the past and future. Human beings grasp the universal nature by which similars are grouped together. Rationality is being able to conceptualize and apply deliberate forms of past and present thought to make decisions, and more generally, to think abstractly without material references. Rationality and conceptual thought are fundamental human characteristics, and they are the foundational basis of what separates us from other animals. The second is the development of complex mathematical models that provides us with a fundamentally different means of organizing our society. According to Boston University, the set theory in mathematics is quite literally the abstract collection of objects. In other words, the capacity of abstract language is a prerequisite to comprehending / making it in the first place, something that is exclusive to humans. This is critical as according to the Stanford Encyclopedia, set theory is one of the greatest achievements of modern mathematics, containing all concepts, methods, and results of math in it. It has served to systematize and unify all mathematical arguments and radiates powerful influence to all branches of mathematics. This is why Professor Ferreiros writes in his book Labyrinth of Thought that sets constitute the foundation of mathematics. This is critical as Ian Stewart or The Telegraph writes, this level of mathematical abilities and understandings found exclusively in humans greatly affect our understanding of daily occurrences such as sounds and how we as a society live such as the creation of sports, development of technology, and breeding daily vegetables. Such leads to a fundamentally different way in which human society is maintained and bonded compared to other animals, and nothing near this caliber is found anywhere in the animal kingdom. Subpoint B is the establishment of a universal moral code. Humans are the only species shown to be truly capable of being self-legislative while also having the ability to confront choices purely on the basis of morality. Look to Carl Cohen, professor of philosophy at University of Michigan, who writes that human beings have the level of intelligence to grasp through human reason the binding character of moral law, as well as the self-conscious participation in an objective ethical order. Humans are the only beings with organic membership to an organic moral community. No other animal is capable of possessing this unique universal moral will and autonomy to self-governing these laws. Humans are also capable of confronting choices that are purely moral. Animals simply lack this judgment of free moral judgment. Helene Goldberg of Open University explains why this level of morality is fundamentally different from that of other animals, saying humans and animals negotiate conflict by fundamentally different means. Behaviors that seem to be out of morality is simply just out of evolution or just to minimize conflict and strengthen social ties among group-dwelling animals. Human beings, however, negotiate conflict through socially created values and codes of conduct that is far beyond the biological necessity of reducing conflict. Additionally, we must understand that through the Nagel evidence, in order to have systems of morality such as deontology require the level and degree of the significant degree of abstract thought and abstract language found in humans, and without that prerequisite, no other entity can actually possess this type of universal moral will, and for these reasons, I am proud to affirm.
So before we begin, I too would like to extend a couple of thank yous. So first to my coaches, Mr. Michael, I truly couldn't have envisioned a better way to spend my last tournament with you. Everything you've taught me these past 2 years extend far beyond debate, and I couldn't be more grateful. Next, Lorinda. I've truly loved working so closely with you these past few months, and your extensive philosophical knowledge continues to amaze me. And Brandon, you couldn't be here today, but your impact both on my debating abilities and my character at large have been so extensive, and it's the reason you have transformed me into what I am today. Next to my parents, your endless love and support continues to drive me every single day, and I owe all of my success to you. And to my brothers Eli and Mark, thank you for setting the bar so high and continually driving me to do better. And to my teammates and friends, both here and back at home, thank you for always being there to support me, making me laugh, and making this activity so enjoyable. And finally, to the John Templeton Foundation, thank you for supporting this nation's youth by continuing to fund this program. Hopefully, your efforts in supporting Big Questions debate will resonate with countless schools across the nation who do not support the speech and debate community. So, with that, I will read my negative constructive. Is everyone ready? Let's begin. I negate. Fundamental is defined by Random House as relating to basic and primitive structure. The burden of the affirmative is to identify a difference in kind as opposed to a difference in degree. Contention 1, neurological pattern processing. To fully understand the implications of the mammalian brain structure, we must first understand how it functions. The fundamental function of the brain is to encode and integrate information acquired from the environment through sensory inputs and then generate behavioral responses. This function is known as pattern processing. Pattern processing requires the brain regions of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, both of which are ubiquitous in the mammalian class. Pattern processing begins with our eyes and ears. When they're open, they're continually detecting images and sounds, the details of which are encoded in nerve cell circuits in the visual and auditory regions of the cerebral cortex. The neurally encoded visual and auditory patterns are then transferred into hippocampal circuits via neurons in the prefrontal cortex. Pattern processing abilities enable the development of social bonds and networks. Pattern processing explains the physical neurology behind mammalian communication with the natural world, thus proving humans and animals to be fundamentally similar on a physical level. Contention 2, metaphysical consciousness. Neurodarwinism is a large-scale school of thought of brain function initially proposed in 1978 by the American biologist Gerald Edelman. Edelman distinguishes between two types of consciousness. Sensory consciousness is the awareness of the present and immediate past through senses. For example, a person's experience of the blueness of the ocean or the feeling of pain. Proto-consciousness is an individual's accessibility to their history and plans. Edelman's theory focuses on two nervous system organizations, the brainstem and limbic systems on one side and the thalamus and cerebral cortex on the other side. Not only do humans and animals both possess sensory and proto-consciousness, but the brain structures that make this possible are essential to the acquisition of certain cognitive abilities, such as metacognition and mentally time traveling, which proves that animals are capable of thought in the metaphysical world. Metaphysics include non-tangible concepts such as justice or morality, which are often referred to as universals. These two neural complexes empirically generate the ability for animals, most commonly rats, to contemplate such universals. The metaphysical world is merely an extension of the physical world, proving humans and animals to be fundamentally similar both on a neurological and metaphysical basis. Contention 3, behavioral sciences. Subpoint A, dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays an enormous role in the decision-making processes of humans and other animals. A team of researchers from Salk Institute of Biological Sciences discovered that dopamine governs choices so precisely that measuring the brain chemical level right before a decision allows researchers to accurately predict the outcome. Researchers designed an experiment in which mice were forced to make a decision between two levers in order to win a treat. The researchers used a technique called optogenetics that uses beams of light to manipulate the animal's brain dopamine levels. They found they were able to manipulate the mice to move from one lever to the other just by increasing or decreasing dopamine levels. Similarly, a Virginia Tech research team conducted a human experiment involving a similar decision-making process. The results paralleled that of the mice experiment, thus proving mammalian behavior and decision-making processes are governed by whichever choice has a greater dopamine level. The function of dopamine in mammalian bodies is threefold. First, in the prefrontal cortex, dopamine secretions affect memory, learning processes, and how information is retained. Second, dopamine is the central chemical in the brain that regulates how you perceive and experience pleasure. Third, in order for the basal ganglia, the brain structure that controls bodily movements, to function, it relies on a secretion of a specific amount of dopamine from neighboring neurons. Thus, because dopamine governs human and animal decision-making processes, it is a fundamental feature in regards to mammalian behavior. Subpoint B, classical and operant conditioning. These are two different ways in which humans and other animals are programmed to behave. Classical conditioning is based on conditioning a response to a certain stimuli. The conditioned response is typically a reflex. One of the best known examples of classical conditioning is Pavlov's experiments on domestic dogs. Russian behaviorist Ivan Pavlov classically conditioned his dog to drool every time he rang a bell by creating an illusion to make the dog think that he will receive meat. Over time, he came to associate the stimulus, or the sound of the bell, with the drooling response. In operant conditioning, however, an animal's behavior is conditioned by the consequences that follow. That is, a behavior will happen either more or less often depending on its results. Animals and humans learn by the principles of operant conditioning every day. We learn that when we push the power button on the remote control that the TV comes on. These two different types of conditioning demonstrate how human and non-human animals' actions and behaviors are governed by the same processes. Thank you.
Ready for cross-ex?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Since I spoke first, may I have the first question?
Sure.
Okay. So at the very top, you say that we have to look at a difference in kind versus difference in degree, right? Okay, what is your warrant for this?
Okay, so basically we're looking into difference in kind. It's connected back to my definition, right? I define fundamental as relating to basic and primitive structure. It also relates to your definition as essential structure.
No,
the only way to determine if something is truly fundamentally different is if it exists in something in absolutely no capacity.
Okay, so
but
what
a
is
difference in degree would be if it exists in something in a certain capacity. That means it still exists, therefore it's not fundamentally different.
So you're citing Adler.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. You can have a question.
Sure. So on your subpoint B, you talk about a universal moral code that governs human behavior. What is this?
So, for example, right, when I tell someone don't steal, or when we make the process of the action to not steal, we don't decide that based on, oh, if I steal this, this and this will happen, thus I won't steal. We don't steal because of the fundamental idea that stealing is different, and we're able to comprehend that.
Okay, so why does that negate the fact that animals aren't governed by a moral code?
Animals are not. Animals can't be governed by a moral code because everything they do is based on consequentialism and the
How?
Okay, because what Nagel specifically tells you in my case is that in order to be governed by a universal moral code, you have to have the level of abstract language and complexity of it must be that of humans, and that's a prerequisite.
Why do I have to have the ability to think in the abstract to be moral?
Because when I say don't steal, I don't have to name off every single different scenario in which you could steal. I just have to say don't steal, and you're able to comprehend the abstract meaning of what stealing is, right?
Okay,
because
so if I can prove that animals do have abstract thought, then that's a prerequisite to accessing
absolutely
this moral
not.
code?
Absolutely not. You have to prove that animal abstract language is as complex as humans because
Why though? Wouldn't that just be a difference in degree?
Because no. Okay. So let me kind of run through that link chain. Sure. At that level, so human abstract language, animal abstract language differences can be seen as a difference in degree. However, that large difference in degree of humans materializes into what is fundamentally different, which is us operating under universal morality. That's the framework that I propose.
So
May I have a question?
If I can, yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. So let's go up to the top. Let's go back to the framework debate of difference in kind versus degree. So you agree that you're basically citing Adler, right?
I mean, I'm not specifically citing Adler,
okay,
but
then
if Adler says that, that's
fine.
fine.
What other philosopher besides Adler writes about this? I don't have to cite a philosopher.
It's my own interpretation of the resolution, right? That's why we debate.
So,
we both
but
debate
Adler is the only credible person that writes about your specific framework, correct?
Okay, well, that's not. You don't have to cite someone to have.
No, I'm not saying.
It's my own analysis.
I'm not saying you do. I just want to make sure that Adler is the only credible person that writes about this. Okay, well, if you're going to make the argument that
Adler affirms the resolution, I don't have to agree with everything Adler says. Rather, I just use this one interpretation he has. But it's even my interpretation, so you can't even make that substantially.
Okay, that's fine. I'll start perhaps starting now. Okay, stop prep. I have 1:17. Okay, for the judges, it's going to be framework, and then it's going to be on the framework, and then just kind of top down, and then I'll just be weighing and talking about my case if time allows. Starting on the con. Everyone's ready?
Yep.
All right. Let's begin on the framework debate. We both propose the same dictionary definition of fundamental, but we disagree on the interpretation, what that means in the context of this resolution. Having said that, let's go into how she interprets it. She says that in order to be a fundamental difference, there must be a difference in kind. But what she does, the important thing here is that the only reliable philosopher that actually writes about this framework is going to be Adler. She doesn't cite Adler specifically because she's very well aware of Adler's conclusions under his own framework that he wrote. Remember, the Adler evidence my opponent is reading off has two parts. The first is Adler on machines, which is what my opponent is citing off of. However, the issue here is that on the very next section titled Adler on Man, a section where he explicitly applies that framework to the context of this resolution. In other words, the degree of kind between humans and animals, meaning that's the only section that we should look to. He says, quote, when the difference in kind cannot thus be reduced to a difference in degree, it remains a difference in kind. The intellectual human mind has properties that cannot be reduced to a difference in degree from the minds of other mammals. The difference in kind is radical, not superficial. And at the point where my opponent's author under his framework and a Harvard professor concludes under framework affirmative, you prefer a Harvard professor's interpretation of his own framework over any high schoolers. In addition, at this point, you have to vote off my point on conceptual thought because my opponent's author says the human operates in a world of conceptual thought where it deals with the objects that are not perceptually present, nor can they ever be. This ability makes it a radical difference in kind. You draw a line from my flow all the way across the flow. But let's go on to how she's interpreting fundamental. Let me tell you why you prefer my definition. She says that fundamental is like the basic primitive structure. But there are three reasons why you don't buy that genetic and molecular similarities are proof of fundamental difference. First is that this viewpoint is infinitely regressive and reductionist. When you go down to this rabbit hole, what the most basic of things are, you go far beyond that just the genes and neurons, as those are also composed of things like atoms. At that point, everything in the universe is fundamentally the same. I can say that I am fundamentally the same as a fire extinguisher on my laptop because we, at the end of the day, are just a blob of atoms. Buying my opponent's framework allows for this infinite regression, which justifies that the same as the ceiling. Harlan Goldberg of Open University explains that this kind of philistinism, however, would force us to ignore the essential differences that result as a result of advanced structure. And my opponent just stops this race to the bottom at the point that strategically benefits them, which makes no sense. Either go all the way or not. This is why the Business Insider writes in 2016 that when practically evaluating the fundamental aspects of humanity, all scientists in the context of this resolution look at how that materializes into the way we live and how our society is shaped. So at that point, this race to the bottom creates a double bind for my opponent. Either stay consistent, go all the way to the bottom, which is not DNA, it is atoms, and admit that this position permits no afterground and no debate because nothing can be fundamentally different. Or go with my framing, which not only is appropriate in the context of today's debate, but it's also the most widely accepted definition. And in the questions of big questions debate, the widely accepted definition should always be preferred as it increases accessibility, and the accessibility, and we're talking about when we're talking about like real life things, it increases education because we can get what we get out from debate and apply it to actual things. Now, going to her first contention where she talks about how like everything is essentially just like all the neural networks and everything. I agree, but we don't define this as the fundamental similarity. We define this as just similar things, and we look at the end result, stay consistent, make sure it's clear. But then on her second contention where she talks about metaphysical things, and she cites Edelman, how saying like animals exhibit the critical forms of consciousness in both humans and animals. But the issue here is that Edelman ultimately concludes that, quote, the identifications of animal analogs to these processes will require demonstration of very close homology so far not achieved. In other words, Edelman also agrees that these similarities that animals have of human traits aren't to the degree of humanity. That's going to be really important later on. I'll give you that weighing analysis later. But then let's go down to like the dopamine more. Let's go on dopamine, saying everything operates on dopamine. The issue here is that first, the gene called TH, which is involved in the dopamine production, is only exclusive to humans, and human dopamine operates off of that gene that doesn't exist in humans, at the point where human dopamine production and the way dopamine affects humans is fundamentally different. Even under her framework at a structural level, you have to affirm.
I'll take a little bit of prep.
Okay.
That's good. It's a minute used, 2 minutes left. Okay, in this speech, I'm going to attack the affirmative case and then move on to the negative, and I'll start with framework. Is everyone ready? Mm-hmm. Okay, first discussing framework. Basically, in response to my framework, my opponent says that Adler would affirm today's resolution, therefore we would affirm. But rather, I never even cite Adler in the first place. My opponent wants to bind me into Adler's interpretation of the resolution, but rather it's my own interpretation. And secondly, he says that we prefer a philosopher over a high school debater, but realize the whole purpose of debate in the first place is to interpret the resolution in the way we wish and then back it up with evidence. So at that point, you wouldn't listen to either of us. We wouldn't be here today if we don't listen to high schoolers. But then further than that, he says that the fundamental definition means that my fundamental definition means that everything in the world is fundamentally similar, but that's not at all what I'm saying. Rather, I'm saying that we look to basic and primitive structure and sure, essential structure, meaning that if something is absolutely essential to humans that does not exist in any capacity in other animals, then you would affirm. But I'm going to show you that every difference that he points out is rather a difference in degree, meaning it exists in humans and animals just to a different capacity. With that, let's go to the affirmative first contention, where he talks about in his subpoint A about the ability to think in the abstract. First, we look to Corballis 13, who explains the warrant as to how animals have this ability. They explain that a widespread network in the brain known as the default mode network is involved in autonomous mental activity, including mental time travel. This network has been identified in humans as well as in rats. A critical region in the network in the hippocampus, which is active in humans both when they recall past episodes and imagine future ones. This gives biologists reason to believe that animals do in fact have the ability to think in the abstract. Then secondly, the University of Georgia conducted an empirical study that further proved this analysis. When rats are in a well-known maze, the sequential firing of so-called place cells in the hippocampus suggests that the rats can cognitively sweep ahead, considering one path and then the other before making a decision about where to go. At that point, you buy my warrant and the empirical evidence I give you. At this point, my opponent has not even given you a warrant as to why animals cannot think in the abstract. But then further than that, go to my opponent's subpoint B, where he talks about a universal moral code. First and foremost, we don't have to be held to the same moral threshold, or animals don't have to be held to the same moral threshold that humans are to prove that they have morality. They do in fact have morality, just animals aren't held to the same exact moral threshold. We see morality portrayed in predator-prey complexes. We see morality when animals portray instances of altruism and justice and things like that. But then third, realize that animals are able to understand and comprehend things in the exact same way as humans. He tells you this is a huge part about thinking in the abstract and having a moral code. He tells you that being able to understand is the prerequisite to morality. But then we look to Matson 14, who explains that all mammals are able to comprehend and to make decisions and choices based upon the prior learning experiences. The superior intellectual capabilities of humans are solely the result of the increase in the number of neurons and synapses. There is no uniqueness in the structural or functional properties. At that point, that proves literally that it's a difference in degree. But then we go to the negative side of the flow. On the first contention, my opponent basically says that it's not a fundamental similarity. In no way does he actually attack the content of what I'm saying. But then further than that, I would argue that pattern processing is absolutely essential to our structure. That's his definition, considering it's the way that we interact with the world. And that's fundamentally similar to other animals because animals use pattern processing as well. So you extend the content. And then the second contention, I talk about metaphysical consciousness. My opponent basically says that Edelman will also affirm today's resolution, therefore you don't buy what I'm saying. But here's the thing. This is a really big cop-out of what I'm actually talking about. He doesn't actually address this idea of sensory and proto-consciousness. And then further than that, on contention 3, subpoint A, I talk about dopamine. My opponent basically says that in humans there exists a certain gene that regulates dopamine. He doesn't prove why this is fundamentally different. Thank you.
May I have the first question?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So let's go back to the framework on Adler. You say that the point of high school debate is to talk about things that maybe even professionals came to the conclusion on.
Yeah, so the point of this argument was to prove that I can interpret the resolution as I wish. Okay. I don't have to be binded to a certain philosopher or Harvard professor.
I think the reason why we're able to do that in many instances of high school debate is because there is credible literature on both sides of interpreting the affirmative and the negative. At the point where the only credible literature that actually talks about this framework and framing humans and animals concludes affirmative, how can we conclude that how can we ever affirm?
Okay, so I would answer that with a question for you. Just because I agree with one thing someone says, does that mean I have to agree with every single word that comes out of their mouth?
But if that one thing that someone is saying is completely justified and I think you do have to agree with it, right?
Wait, so if something is justified, if someone says something that's justified, I have to agree with every other thing they said? Does that automatically mean that every other thing they say is going to be justified?
No, that's not what I'm saying. But the thing is, all I'm saying is that you prefer the Harvard professor's interpretation of his own framework over any high school
I'm telling you that we should
debater.
prefer the Harvard professor's interpretation. That's why I'm telling you we prefer a difference in kind
That's cool.
as opposed to a difference in degree.
That's cool. You can have a question.
So do you want to explain your framework?
Yeah, so let me kind of go through this whole link chain. So what I'm saying is that in terms of interpreting the fundamental difference between humans and animals in the scientific community, here's how it goes down. What the scientific community looks at is like, how do these basic primitive structures like neurons and things materialize into ways of living that are fundamentally different from other animals? For instance, we can argue that animals do possess a degree of abstract language, but the really critical thing here is Nagel tells you, as long as animals don't possess that level of complexity of abstract language that humans do, which all of your evidence actually says that only possesses a degree of it, not 100% of it. That level of cognitive ability materializes into what is fundamentally different, which is universal moral code of humans.
So didn't we already agree to Adler's interpretation that we're just talking about a difference in kind as opposed to a difference in degree?
Yes.
Isn't a level of complexity a difference in degree?
No, because universal morality, not any intermediate form of it is found in any other animals in the animal kingdom. So even under Adler's framework,
let's talk about that.
Sure.
So does that mean that animals have to have the same moral threshold in order to have morality?
I'd argue that animals don't have morality at all, at the point where all of their moral actions are just based on consequentialism.
Can we agree that they can just possess some capacity of morality?
No. You cannot call something morality if the actor is not consciously acting ethically, right?
Okay, when is the last time your dog? I'm asking you if animals possess some sort of capacity for morality, does that mean they are moral?
That's kind of like asking if someone has an apple in her hand, does she have an apple? Like, I don't really understand.
So it
is
is moral, right?
Animals just don't have morality in the first place.
Okay.
Okay, I'll start prep time starting now. Okay, stop prep. I have 12 seconds remaining. It's going to be framework and then down the neg and the af. I'll signpost where I am. Before I get into the actual framework stuff, you extend Adler when she admits that we always prefer the Harvard professor's interpretation over any other high school debater, especially when no other credible literature actually concludes otherwise under her own framework. But having said that, let me get into why I still win, even if you disregard that. extend my definition by Merriam-Webster. We both agree it is the essential structure / function of something, but the issue here is that you understand it says what is the essential structure, not what is essential to the structure or function. This is critical because think of it this way, right? Hydrogen is essential to the structure and function of both H2O and H3O. However, the essence or the essential property of the two are considered completely different. In that way, when we determine the essential property of humans, it only makes sense that we look out into how those micro-level advantages like increase in neurons essentially materialize into these different properties. And you have to prefer this definition, for my interpretation, fundamental look at the end result for 3 reasons. First, she drops my double-blind analysis that tells you that her point of view is infinitely regressive, and she only, like with no warrant, stops at the level that only helps her. But secondly, she also never regards that this is the most widely interpreted way of in this context, and you prefer that for 3 reasons. The first is because big questions debate is meant to synthesize viewpoints of experts across all scientific and ethical disciplinaries. Second, in order for our claims about human and animal natures of similarities to be widely accepted, we must start from the widely accepted viewpoint. And the third is simply education and accessibility. When we use the most widely accepted definition, it's accessible to all programs around the world, but there's also more literature on it, and we don't debate on weird, skewed ground. At that point, you have to prefer my interpretation of what fundamental difference is. Now, let's go into how you vote AF, because I am the only side that actually answers how this end result materializes. So, essentially, my opponent's way of breaking everything down is infinitely regressive, and you prefer mine where I tell you stop and look at the end result of how those basic building blocks materialize. Here's the link chain into how I win, and why you should affirm. Yes, at the most basic level, humans just have more genes and more neurons, etc. But this increase in number of neurons, or whatever, leads to this great complex degree of abstract language. Now, while you can argue that this is just a difference in degree, the difference becomes fundamental when that level of complex abstract language materializes into humans being the only moral beings that operate under this universal moral code / deontological way we live our lives. Now, so it's just like how the extra hydrogen atom in H3O completely changes the essence of from H2O. We at this point know that the universal moral code is exclusive to humans. My Nagel evidence that she drops explicitly says having abstract language in the complexity to the degree of humans is a prerequisite to having this universal moral code, and all of her studies eventually can only say that animals possess it to a certain degree, not to the level of humans. But now she's going to come up here and try to tell you that that animals are also like moral actors. But understand, in order to be truly ethical, it requires the capacity to intentionally act under a certain moral framework. It can be argued that certain observable behaviors in animal exhibits quality as a consequential of the moral framework. However, it is critical that the actor must be doing so intentionally for it to constitute an act of ethics. For these reasons, you have to affirm.
Okay, I'll use a little bit of prep.
Okay.
Okay, that's good. So a little bit above a minute left, like minute 6 seconds. All right, I'm going to go framework, NC, AC. Is everyone ready?
Yep.
Okay, well, let's begin. So the framework debate is very, very simple. We both already agreed to Adler's interpretation, even though he binded me to it, which is a difference in kind as opposed to a difference in degree. He himself agreed to it. At that point, it's very simple. If humans possess this unique capacity that makes us so radically different from other animals, then you would affirm. But if animals have that capacity just to a lesser degree, then you would negate. It's a very simple interpretation. He is trying to put this impossible burden on me, telling you that any difference, no matter how minute and no matter how small the degree may be, is fundamental. First of all, he doesn't explain to you why, but even further than that, we'll get into that in the contention level now. So the first contention on the AC, basically he responds to my attacks. First of all, he dropped the cards, I'll extend those later, but he responds to the attack. He basically continues to say that humans have such a high complexity of language. But ask yourself why that's important. The importance of language is to communicate. communicate. I've already proven that communication is ubiquitous in the mammalian class. But then further than that, I explained that the process by which animals communicate is the exact same as the process by which humans communicate. It's called pattern processing. He has yet to respond to this. I talk about it in my first contention. Then further than that, he has no warrant as to why human communication is so complex. He tells you it's complex. First of all, he doesn't tell you how, nor does he tell you why. I tell you both of those. Judges, when weighing each argument in today's round, ask yourself those questions. You'll realize that he rarely answers them in today's round. So you extend the idea that pattern processing is ubiquitous in the mammalian class because of our sensory inputs and because the details of which the sensory inputs that we have are engraved in the nerve cell circuits, which are then deposited in the hippocampal regions of our brain. What that means is that humans and animals process information in the same exact way. They learn and comprehend in the same exact way, meaning they communicate in the same exact way, just not as complex as us. But then go to subpoint, or you extend the cards that I give you. First, Corbellus 13. Basically what that's talking about is the ability for animals to think in the abstract. It's due to the default mode network in our brain. He doesn't respond to this. You extend it through. What this proves is that animals too have the ability to think in the abstract. Then further, you extend the University of Georgia card. That proves that mice have the ability to mentally sweep ahead, meaning mentally time travel, meaning thinking in the abstract. At that point, you extend the empirical evidence. Then even further than that, I cite this Matson 14 card, which explains that animals learn and comprehend in the same exact way as humans. Then you go to the NC and realize that he dropped everything. The first contention, again, pattern processing, you extend it all the way through. What this means is that the way in which humans interact with the natural world is identical to animals. Second contention, I talk about consciousness. Again, you extend it, realize animals too have the ability to think in the metaphysical world. And then contention 3, both dopamine and classical and operant conditioning, you draw it through the flow and realize that we behave the same exact way. Thank you.
I'll use the rest of my prep starting now. Okay. It's going to start off with the voter framework and then voters again. I'll signpost. Everyone ready? Right.
Yeah.
Easiest place you can vote is the concession on Adler, where he tells you that even the only person that actually writes about the framework concludes affirmative, and Adler is explicitly saying so. You vote off of that when she concedes that that's the most reliable way of interpreting it. But even without that, let me tell you why we're winning. So in terms of the framework definition, remember, she drops all of the reasons why you prefer my interpretation of what a fundamental difference is in the context of today's resolution versus hers. What she says is that we break it down into the microscopic levels, but she drops my double bind where I tell you that's essentially infinitely regressive. You stop it how the scientific community actually views it, and a clear end, which is the end result of how all of that materializes. Now, that's going to be the biggest voter in today's round. We're at the point where she cannot prove to you with a single one of her studies that any other animal possesses the abstract language of complex thinking to the degree of humans. She's trying to muddle that argument by saying, like, I'm trying to say a significant degree is a difference in kind. That is not at all what I'm saying. I've been really clear. We need to look at how those small neurological differences, how these degrees of difference materialize into things that are fundamentally different. Nagel is the biggest voter in today's round, where Nagel tells you that in order to possess a universal moral code, the level of complexity and abstract language of humans is a prerequisite to having any sort of that universal moral code. Now, she tries to respond to this at the warrant level, saying I don't give a warrant as to like how animals like aren't as advanced as humans. The first is that my Holberg card specifically mentions that currently humans are the only ones with this complexity of language. She says that and it definitely is her burden to show a single example of an animal case study that shows animals having abstract language to the degree of humans. And my second warrant to why animals don't have this level of complexity is that it simply has not been observed yet. But remember, we're debating about what we know currently. It would be abusive for it to say that in the future somehow we're going to find an animal that has abstract language to the degree of humans. Currently we do not, and that is what materializes into the great amount of fundamental difference. And if if you buy into that link chain, you automatically default affirmative, because in her last speech, she did not touch on a single point as to how animals could A, not be moral actors because they cannot be aware that they're acting ethically, but secondly, she also agrees that humans are the only ones that operate on this deontological framework. So let me boil down how this goes. First, you vote on Adler anyway because but then she says that, like, I have to prove a difference in kind and no intermediate ground. Let me make that very clear. No other animal possesses any even diluted sort of life under universal moral code. You look at how, in the context of this resolution, fundamental difference is how those micro-level differences materialize into the end result. The end result is humans possessing the universal moral code, and that in itself is different from other animals in kind because no other animals possess any degree of universal moral code. She's going to come up here and say that it dropped a bunch of studies, but understand the important thing is that as none of those studies actually explicitly say animals possess characteristics that are advanced as humans, you cannot buy any of them. That's why I don't address every single one, because none of them, all of them have the same conclusion, and they all eventually end up affirming.
I'll use the remaining 6 seconds of my prep time.
Okay.
It's time. In the speech, I'll just address the framework, framing of the round, and then key voting issues. Is everyone ready? Okay. Let's begin. This round is going to be very, very simple, mainly because my opponent provides a lot of claims, none of which are warranted by actual neurological analyses. With that, let's talk about framework. So basically, his idea that Adler affirms today's round, therefore you would affirm because I use Adler, is simply absurd. First of all, I never cited Adler in the first place. Second of all, just because Adler uses a similar interpretation does not mean he can bind me to every single word that comes out of Adler's mouth. With that, we agree on framework. We agree that the fundamental means that basic essential structure, and we agree that he has to prove a difference in kind as opposed to a difference in degree. With that, let's go to the first key voting issue. It's going to be abstract thought. Again, he continually says abstract thought is uniquely human because it has not been observed in other animals, but I give you 3 cards telling you that it absolutely has. First of all, I give you the warrant, which is why how it's been observed in other animals. It's because of our neural structure called the default mode network. It's located in our frontal lobe. It basically grants other animals the ability to think in the abstract. Then I give you the empirical evidence which proves that animals can think in the abstract. Again, that was the mice experiment, which proved that through using brain scanners, the University of Georgia researchers concluded that the rats were able to cognitively sweep ahead and think about one path and then the other. So at that point, I give you the warrant and the empirical evidence, none of which he has provided you in today's round. With that, the second key voting issue is going to be morality. Again, he continually says that animals don't have morals, but I tell you they absolutely do. Sure, they're not held to the same moral threshold as humans are, but they do have morals. This is portrayed in the predator-prey complex. Again, we already agreed on the framework that he has to prove a difference in kind, and because animals have morals, meaning morality exists in some capacity in animals as it does in humans, that's a difference in degree, not in kind. The third key voting issue is going to be pattern processing. My opponent has not attacked this in the entirety of today's round. I talk about this in my first contention. Basically, it's the idea that the way in which humans retain and process and transfer information is absolutely identical to the way in which animals do this. It's because of our sensory inputs. They're encoded in nerve cell circuits, which are then deposited in the hippocampal region of our brain, which we can then use those patterns to process and transfer information to other animals and to interact with the natural world. He drops this. What this shows is that humans and animals act the exact exact same on a behavioral and neurological level. Realize throughout today's entire round, my opponent has not shown the warrant as to why animals can't neurologically communicate with others. Then the fourth key voting issue is going to be behavioral sciences. This is my fourth contention, third contention. He drops this, he does not respond to it. Basically, what this is saying is that we will us as well as other animals will always be governed by whichever choice has a greater dopamine level. Then I talk about classical and operant conditioning. Basically, it's the idea that us and other animals respond to certain stimuli in the exact same way. Thank you. Good round.
Good round.
As our judges complete their decisions, I'd like to congratulate both competitors who will be awarded a total of $15,000 in scholarship from the John B. Templeton Foundation tonight at the award ceremony. Please give a round of applause for Miss Clare Abboud from Jackson High School in Ohio, and Seung Jo Cho from Elsie Anderson High School from Texas.
At this time, please welcome to the stage the finalists in Big Questions debate, which was held this week in conjunction with the national tournament and presented by the John Templeton Foundation. Tonight, we recognize the top 4 teams in Big Questions, a debate format supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. This year, students have grappled with complex worldview questions as they debate both sides of the topic. Resolved: humans are fundamentally different from other animals. Tournaments, districts, and classrooms that hold Big Questions debate are eligible to receive thousands of dollars per event. In the first 2 years of this 3-year grant, the National Speech and Debate Association gave away $1 million. And we have another $500,000 to give away to eligible events during the last year of this grant, the 2018-2019 season. These debates can be held as tournament events, school scrimmages, or classroom events as long as the application requirements are met. Please welcome President Crabtree back to the stage to congratulate the finalists. Your winners in the 2018 Big Questions debate. Semi-finalist in 4th place, receiving a $2,500 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation. Jennifer Wang from Lincoln East High School in Nebraska, coached by John Holden and Rachel Stevens. Semi-finalist in 3rd place, receiving a $2,500 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation. Kyler Groner from Morristown West High School in Tennessee, coached by Suzanne Terry. Placing 2nd and receiving a $5,000 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation, Clare Abboud from Jackson High School in Ohio, coached by Lorinda Johnson. And your champion, receiving a $10,000 scholarship, $10,000 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation, and winning on a 4-3 decision, Seung Jo Choi from Elsie Anderson High School in Texas, coached by Robbie Holland.